Hi students, this lecture we're going to talk more about the Bootstrap library, CSS and JavaScript, some more front-end kind of stuff we're going to talk about, so we're going to continue on with that theme. The first thing I'll mention is the last video I included a lot of these libraries that we used with the library manager, and I had some typos in it, so make sure that if you're having errors, like for example, um, I think this popper.js maybe I didn't have in the right folder, so I think I forgot this folder. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like if you're not getting the intended result. So I think in Visual Studio, if you don't have the right folder, it should give you like an underline that it can't find the folder or file. It doesn't really do that in Visual Studio Code. It's not giving me an error that it can't find this file. So if you go ahead and run it, I'm going to go ahead and run this. And it pops this up, and then nothing really is wrong. But if when I did run mine, I had some CSS issues. The CSS wasn't loading. So if you do an F12 and then you go to the console, you can actually see from the console that it failed to load this resource. So if you F12 and go to your console, any of the libraries that you have there, it should give you an error if it can't find it. If it couldn't find it. And you can see over here, failed to load resource, and then on the right side, so you get a 404 not found. And then over here on the right hand side, you can see the resource that it can't find. So it said it can't find this lib popper min.js. So if I go ahead and exit out of this, and exit out of this, then you can come here and notice, okay, it was supposed to be in lib popper min.js. So then I'll go over here to where my files are in my www root folder in lib and popper. And then you can see there's this popper CJS. And then within that folder, there's this popper min.js. So I said, okay, then I guess it also needs to be in that CJS folder. So then I went ahead and did CJS. I click save. I'll go ahead and run it again. Then once I run it again, that error should go away in the console. So then if it doesn't, you can always do a Control Shift or Control F5, Control plus F5, and that should clear all of the cache out of your browser. And then from there, you can either click Inspect, or you can just do it function F12. And now I'm getting a different error. This export S is not defined. So it can actually find it now, but for some reason one of the it looks like some of the versions might be clashing. So it can actually find it now. I'm just getting a different error. So now that I can find it, I can move on, since it can find all of my libraries. So I'm going to go ahead and stop running now. So throughout the rest of this lecture, I'm going to cover the Bootstrap, as well as all of the stuff that you get with the Bootstrap CSS. Now there's an entire, what's the word I'm looking for, certification on Bootstrap and JavaScript and CSS. So I could do an entire course on all of the things you can do with Bootstrap and JavaScript and CSS and jQuery. So I'm just going to try to hit the high points in the PowerPoint, because there's no way you're going to memorize all this unless you're trying to get the certification. So the best way to probably go about this is to just mention all of the things that you have available to you, and then when you go to build your user interface, you could go to the Bootstrap documentation, you can go to the PowerPoint, you can go to the book, and go to that exact section that shows how you do that in Bootstrap whenever you need to do it. So I'm just going to educate you on all of your options in Bootstrap. So the first thing I did was I wanted to demonstrate the Bootstrap grid system. So what Bootstrap is it's essentially a grid system. So if you open up like an Excel spreadsheet, it's a bunch of rows and columns. That's kind of what Bootstrap is. So divides your web page into rows and columns. So what I did was if I go to my index view, I commented out all of the stuff we had for our future value application in the user interface portion. And what I did was I pasted in what's in the PowerPoint for displaying or showing this grid system. So if you look, we have everything in this main container. So that contains all of the UI elements we have for our application, or this page that we're trying to show, not really our entire application, but just the page we're on. And then from there we have a division of a row. So now we're going to say, I want, if you look at a web page, it's all built on a row first, and then it builds it on columns. So it's rows first and then columns. And then we have a class of col-12 or col12. And what that means is we want this to take up the entire row. So Bootstrap has 12 columns essentially that you can take up, and if you say col12, it's saying I want this element to take up all 12 columns. So here we have another row, and then here we say we want this column on a medium screen to only take up 4 columns, or we want this to only take up 8 columns on a medium screen. And then you can get more granular and say here's a row, and I want this particular division to take up 4 columns on a medium screen, but then once it gets to, sorry, I didn't mean to move that, but then once it gets to a small screen, I want it to divide up a little bit differently. So then once we go to run this, I'm going to go ahead and save it. And then now pretty much what we're doing, there's no difference between Visual Studio and here since we're just working in files, so don't worry that I'm in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to go ahead and run this application. And it's going to give us the same screen that I've already shown you previously. So let's go ahead and try to start making this a little bit smaller to see exactly what this is doing with these elements in Bootstrap. So if you remember the first element, if I could get it on the screen at the same time, this first element here in the col xs12 or the col12, we wanted it to show up the entire length. So if you look here, it shows up the entire length. So this is the 12 columns that this thing is taking up. And then, so this must be a medium screen. So here we have col md4. So if you look, so essentially it should take up a third, and this should take up 2/3. So here this takes up a third, and this takes up 2/3, and that happens with both of these elements. So the difference is once we get to a small screen, we want the small to take up half for these two elements at the bottom. So once we start making the screen smaller, it should, these columns should be, or these rows should be a bit different once we get to a small screen. So we're going to keep making it smaller. Okay, so we got a medium screen now. So once we have another break, that should be small. Okay, and there's small. So you can see with the small, we have these two that went to the bottom, or these are now stacked. So there is no differentiation on the middle columns for when it breaks to small, but there is a differentiation here that says whenever this goes to small, I want them to take up half, each one to be half, or this one be 6 columns and this be 6 columns. And then once it gets to extra small, or XS, and then they both stack after that. So this is extra small, this is small, and this is medium. So you can see the grid, and then I went ahead and if you look at the CSS, so if your CSS isn't showing up that way, it's because I made some CSS changes back here. So in a row, I wanted the row to have a margin, so half of a unit. And then for rows, for the division under a row, so here's here's the class I'm using, and then a division within that class. I want it to have a border and a background color. That way we could see what exactly those divisions are doing. Okay, so what this is essentially doing is overriding the CSS that's that Bootstrap uses. So Bootstrap also has CSS similar to this, or at least they call out like similar to this. But what we're doing is overriding Bootstrap CSS to have our own custom CSS. So you're also able to do that if you don't like whatever Bootstrap gives you. So it always takes whatever is more specific. So it'll load in the Bootstrap CSS, then it'll load in our CSS after that and try to look for any differences. And then if there is, it'll take ours instead of Bootstrap's because ours is more specific to this row div. So now that we talked about Bootstrap's grid system, we're going to go ahead and move on to the PowerPoint that's included in the lecture. So if you read through Chapter 3, it covers a lot of what Bootstrap has to offer for us as far as the way forms are concerned, the way inputs and labels are concerned, buttons, all kinds of different things. Bootstrap gives us some templates that we can use for our user interface elements. So for example, here's a form group. So they made a class called form group, so it'll look like a form. Here's a form control, so it'll look like a form control, or essentially an input, some way to input information. So it's an input. So then if we look at what this outputs for us, it'll output, and you notice these look a little bit different than the ones we were using. There's some rounded corners on it. It's longer than a usual text input, which you can change that. You can make the division bigger or smaller with Bootstrap depending on what you want it to look like. So it gives you different ways to load forms. Here's a form with more of a horizontal layout, so they always show you the code of how to do it, and then an example. So I believe this one was the one with the horizontal layout, and this one was the one with the vertical layout. So you can see that it's laid out from top to bottom. So email, text box, or label, text box, label, text box. And then here's one with the horizontal layout. So it's laid out more like those Bootstrap elements were. And then you can see they used a row to do that with col sm2. So whenever it breaks to a small screen, the label should take up 2 columns, and the input box should take up 10 columns. So you can see whenever they wanted to do something like this, they have a division with a row, and then within that division of a row, they have 2 other divisions for a label and an input box. So that's how you split those up for a horizontal layout, is you have to put those in a row. So you have to tell it to use Bootstrap and to use a Bootstrap row in the first division, and then in those embedded divisions, then it'll know it's a row, and then it'll take whatever Bootstrap divisions you have from there, and then look at those classes to know how to break up those rows into columns. Here's different button layouts you can do. So you can have a button, you can have a primary button, a secondary button, and that'll make more sense here in the coming slide. There's different ways to work with images. So you can have like a rounded image. There's jumbotrons we can work with. So here in this next slide shows exactly what those are. This is a jumbotron. So it's just a huge thing to put text or images or anything like that, kind of like a billboard. And then from there we have this rounded image. So we have this image rounded, and then here's the different types of buttons. So here's a primary button, and then here's a kind of like a secondary button. So if we go to the next slide to show what that HTML looks like, here is our jumbotron, or like I said, our billboard with our image. And then you can see image fluid rounded, so that's why they had that rounded look to the image, or that Maroc Books image. And then from there we had a form that they wanted to click one of the two buttons, and one of the buttons was the submit button, where it was a primary, so that's why it had that blue color to it. So if you go to the Bootstrap class for BTN primary, you'll probably find that it probably has a background color of blue, it's rounded, and stuff like that. And you can actually see what the Bootstrap CSS is for stuff like the BTN primary. So if I go back here in my CSS for Bootstrap, so here's Bootstrap CSS, and then I can try to find BTN primary and see exactly what that looks like. So you can see the background color is blue, the color for the text is white, or the hashtag FFF, and the border color. It does something different where if it's hovered, it does something different where if the primary or the button is focused, so if you clicked on it, if the button is disabled, it has a little bit different color. So there's all kinds of CSS built in that we don't need to do because it's all built into our Bootstrap that we included in the Libman manager. So going back here, so if you ever wanted to overwrite the BTN primary, you could do it such as the way I did it in this custom CSS file. I could have a BTN primary, and then I could give it its own custom CSS that I'd want. So I don't have it open anymore. Let's go BTN primary. What color is it? Okay, so let's take this background color. It's like a blue. Let's give it another background color. Say hashtag. I'm not very good with RGB. It's like that might be too dark to see anything, but let's go ahead and save that. And I might need to copy this BTN primary button. Let's go ahead and copy this out of the PowerPoint, go back to our main index, and let's paste it here. Let's say, I believe it was a calculate button. And go ahead and save it and run it. And it should overwrite that BTN primary background color for us. So we can see that the background color for that primary button now is that darker all fives hashtag. And then you can see when I hover over it, it changes colors back to what it used to be. So if you ever don't like the color or anything for the Bootstrap CSS, you can always change it to be whatever you want. Let's go ahead and exit out of this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that out of my custom CSS. So there's different ways to do forms we've saw. There's different ways to do buttons. You can already see this PowerPoint is 71 slides long. I don't want this video to go an hour, so I'm just still trying to go through this somewhat quickly. The code is all in the book for the different kinds of elements that you're allowed to do. Here's code for the index view, and you can see they use all of these things. So here's the main container. They have a jumbotron in the header with the rounded look for the Maroc logo. You can see there's a row, so this is going to be a horizontal layout for the form, and it's going to be it uses the form group class, so it makes all of the inputs have rounded corners and whatnot. It uses the Bootstrap call SM3. So you can go through this code and you can see there's a calculate and a clear button, and the clear button is the secondary BTN outline secondary, so it probably has a little bit different of a look than the BTN primary. Here's different CSS classes to work with HTML tables. So here's kind of what an HTML table looks like. So if you want to look through, if you like the way the HTML tables look, you can tell there's a way to do like table striped, table bordered, table hover. So you can see how it gives your table a little bit prettier of a layout to have the gray every other column. Here's different Bootstrap classes that we can use for text. So if we want to have it text left, text right, text center, text lowercase, all this stuff's pretty self-explanatory what it does. So if you have a P tag, you can have text right, text centered, text right aligned, that's uppercase. So you can do all of this type of stuff with custom or built-in Bootstrap, not custom. So we already went through the BTN primaries. There's all kinds of different buttons you can use. So notice this primary has the blue color. The BTN secondary, which kind of is the color that I chose for my button, but there's already a button to do that if you didn't want to have your own custom CSS for your BTN primary. And there's a success button, an information button, a warning button, a danger button, and pretty much they're all the same buttons. They just have different background colors. They have all different rounded corners and stuff like that to use with Bootstrap. Here's a success text message. So if maybe you submitted a form or something like that, here's a paragraph tag for text success, and basically all it does is makes the text green. Here's some more text formatting we can do with Bootstrap. Here's button groups we can do in Bootstrap. So if you want to have a group of buttons, this is kind of like a menu almost. So you can declare a division as a button group, and then from there you can have different hyperlinks. So you notice these are hyperlinks, so they're anchor tags, but it shows up as a button. So the Bootstrap CSS will take, it'll notice that it's a division within an anchor tag, so it'll probably show a division in the custom CSS, and the class is button group, and then under that we'll have different anchor tags, and then it'll format it to look like a button. So here's two different button groups. You can tell that there's a main division, and then within the main division there's two more divisions that are declared as button groups. So it's a button toolbar that has two button groups embedded in it. If you want to have a group of buttons for yours, you can build in icons. So there's a lot of Bootstrap icons you can use. So there's a shopping cart icon built into Bootstrap, a home icon built into Bootstrap you can use. Different things you can do with a shopping cart. So you can have a badge that shows exactly how many items are in your shopping cart. And then you notice it's within a span, and then inside that span is the number that you want to have inside the badge. Here's a drop-down we can do with Bootstrap. So if you have a main division where the class is drop-down, then it will know that within that you should have a couple different buttons or a couple different links to maybe different areas on the web page. So you can have a class equals drop-down, and then exactly how it should toggle. I want this thing to show as a drop-down. And then within my division below it, it'll show exactly which item I want to have. So I want this anchor to be a drop-down item where it goes out to my product list of guitars. So this is the what's the word I'm looking for? This is the URL. Sorry, I don't know why I couldn't think of URL. This is the URL that it goes to whenever you click guitars. This is the URL that it goes to whenever you click drums. So this is a way to do a drop-down. You notice this is all very specific, so if you mistype anything or misspell something, it's not going to work. So you want to make sure that everything is spelled correctly and then the correct location for any of these things to work for Bootstrap to pick it up in its custom CSS file. So here's some list groups that you can do in CSS. Different styles, so you can have the active list group item versus kind of the passive ones or the ones that aren't selected. Here's an alert you can do in Bootstrap. And the code you need for it. Here's a navigation bar. So this is the last part of the chapter going over navigation bars. You can see you use the nav, and then we have the class of nav and nav tabs that we have out of our Bootstrap CSS. And then each anchor below that has a class of nav item, nav link, and then you also have whichever one is active. So I'm pretty sure Bootstrap has built-in ways to change active So if you click on products or cart, it'll change the active one for you. You don't have to do it. It should be built into the Bootstrap JavaScript. So that's already built in for us. We don't have to do anything with that. So you notice the difference between these two slides. This is nav tabs and this is nav tabs pills. So it's still a nav tab, but it looks like a pill kind of instead of, and the only difference was that they changed nav dash tab to nav dash pill or pills. So there's a lot of different ways for your nav tab to look if you want to have a navigation like that. Different ways for your navigation to be displayed. Here's more HTML for a navigation bar if you want to have a navigation bar for your website. Then you can also fix the navigation bar to the top of the screen if you don't want it to move like this. So you can use the fixed top, fixed bottom CSS classes. So you notice here you have your body, and then at the top you have your nav bar, and then we have class equals nav bar. Remember that already. And then we had this fixed top, so it fixes it to the top. And then you can also set the margin for it to have from the top of the screen. And then some websites also have a nav bar fixed to the bottom where you can use the fixed dash bottom CSS property. So I hope this lecture, I covered a lot of Bootstrap capabilities. So you kind of just need to cherry pick exactly what pieces of Bootstrap you want to use with text boxes or buttons or navigation bars or form items or button groups. You'll have to cherry pick what you like and what you want to pick out of the Bootstrap to use, and maybe what you want to build custom, maybe what you don't like as much. Like I said, there's a huge certification on JavaScript and CSS and all that kind of stuff. There's a ton you can do with it. This just covers it at a very 10,000 foot high level of the stuff you can do with Bootstrap. So I hope this helps. I hope this is a good explanation of what Bootstrap can do for us, and we don't need to build all of this stuff custom. It all comes to us out of the box, out of the Bootstrap box. So I would go through the chapter and maybe take some notes on what you like and don't like from Bootstrap, and then I highly encourage you, the only way you're going to learn any of this is to play around with it, play around with building form groups, play around with doing horizontal and vertical layouts, play around with using the row class and then having divs within it to break out things with columns. So the only way to get anything out of this course is to do it. The only way to learn how to program is to program. So I would highly recommend taking a lot of this stuff from the PowerPoint, putting it in your application and trying it out for yourself. So I hope this video is a good explanation of Bootstrap and the grid system. And that's it for this video. So thanks for watching.